The evening crowd at the Blue Note Lounge always arrived in waves. First came the after-work professionals still in their office clothes, looking to unwind with a quick drink before heading home. Then the dinner patrons, followed by the night owls who came for the jazz and stayed until closing. Elena Moretti knew all their patterns by heart. She stood behind the polished wooden bar, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, mixing a gin and tonic with the easy rhythm of someone who had done it thousands of times before. The ice clinked against the glass as she stirred, her movements quick and certain. 3 years at the Blue Note had taught her efficiency, how to serve 4 different orders at once without missing a beat. "Here you go, Mr. Chen," she said, sliding the drink across the bar with a small smile. "Extra lime, just how you like." The middle-aged businessman nodded appreciatively. "You never forget, do you?" "It's my job to remember," Elena replied with a light shrug, already turning to prepare a Manhattan for the woman in the corner booth. What Elena didn't say was that remembering drink orders was the easy part. Her mind naturally cataloged patterns and preferences, storing them away like notes in a musical phrase. The businessman always came on Thursdays, always ordered the same drink, always left a 20% tip. The woman in the corner preferred her Manhattan with an extra cherry, and would nurse it for exactly 45 minutes while reading something on her tablet. The lounge hummed with conversation and the soft notes of a jazz quartet playing in the background. Elena moved behind the bar like a dancer following well-rehearsed steps, reaching for bottles without looking, measuring by eye rather than with jiggers, her hands never still. "You're in the zone tonight," commented Trish, the other bartender, as she squeezed past with a tray of empty glasses. Elena smiled but didn't break her rhythm. Being in the zone was the closest she got these days to the feeling she once knew so well, that state of flow when nothing existed except the movement of her hands and the task before her. The Blue Note was upscale but not pretentious. The lighting was dim enough to feel intimate but bright enough that you could read the drink menu without squinting. Dark blue walls gave the place its name, along with the jazz theme that ran throughout the decor. Vintage album covers and black and white. Photos of legendary musicians lined the walls, and in the corner, commanding attention without trying, sat a glossy black grand piano. Elena rarely looked directly at it. Tonight, the piano was being played by Ray, a retired music teacher who came in 3 nights a week to provide live background music. He was good, technically proficient and reliable, and the customers appreciated the touch of class he added to their evening drinks. "Hey, Elena, can we get another round at table 6? Called out Tom, one of the waiters, as he hurried, past with plates of appetizers balanced on his arm. "Coming right up," she replied, already pulling down glasses for the table's usual order: 2 old fashions, a dirty martini, and a club soda with lime. As she prepared the drinks, a loud burst of laughter erupted from a group of newcomers who had just walked in. 6 men in business suits looking like they'd already had a few drinks elsewhere. Elena's shoulders tensed slightly. Large groups could shift the peaceful atmosphere of the lounge, especially if they'd been drinking. "I'll take this table," Trish murmured, noticing Elena's reaction. "You finish up the orders you're working on." Elena nodded gratefully. She preferred the steady rhythm of regular customers to the unpredictable energy of rowdy groups. She liked knowing what came next, anticipating needs before they were voiced. It was safer that way. As she finished the round for table 6, she heard Philip, the manager, speaking urgently into his phone near the staff entrance. His forehead was creased with worry, and he kept glancing toward the piano. "What do you mean? You can't make it?" "The owner is bringing in potential investors tonight." He paused, listening. "I understand you're sick, but this is..." Another pause. "Fine. Just get better." He hung up and ran a hand through his thinning hair. Elena handed the drink tray to Tom and turned back to wiping down the bar, trying not to eavesdrop but curious all the same. Philip approached the bar, his normally composed face tight with stress. "Ray's out with the flu, can't even speak, let alone come into play. And Mr. Winters is bringing in those investors from Chicago in less than an hour." "That's rough," Trish said, returning to grab more glasses. "Can't you call someone else?" "On a Friday night?" Everyone's already booked. I've tried 3 people. Already. He pulled out his phone again. I'm going to try that music student who filled in last month. Maybe he's free. Elena kept her head down, focusing intently on polishing an already spotless section of the bar. Her heart had begun to beat a little faster, and she forced herself to take slow, even breaths. It wasn't her problem. It had nothing to do with her. 20 minutes later, Philip returned, looking defeated. No luck. Everyone's busy or not answering. He checked his watch. They'll be here in half an hour. Can't you just play recorded music tonight? Trish suggested. Not for this meeting. Mr. Winters specifically told me he wants to showcase the full Blue Note experience, live music included. These investors are thinking about backing his expansion plan, opening Blue Notes in 3 more cities. He sighed. I guess we'll have to go with recordings and hope for the best. Elena felt a strange tightness in her chest, the kind she hadn't felt in years. Her hands, usually so steady when mixing drinks, trembled slightly as she placed a cocktail shaker back on the shelf. I could play, she said so quietly that neither Philip nor Trish heard her at first. What was that? Philip asked, turning toward her. Elena cleared her throat and looked up, meeting his eyes directly for perhaps the first time in the 3 years she'd worked there. I said I could play. The piano. For tonight. Philip and Trish stared at her, as if she'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. You play piano? Philip asked finally. I used to, Elena said, her voice steadier now that the words were out. Used to as in childhood lessons? Or used to as in actually play well? There was a hint of desperate hope in his voice. Elena hesitated. How to explain years of training, of breathing and living music, of being told she had rare talent, all abandoned and locked away. I was trained classically, she said simply. I can play jazz standards too. Why didn't you ever mention this? Before? Trish asked, looking at Elena with new eyes. Elena shrugged, uncomfortable with their sudden attention. It never came up. Philip checked his watch again. Look, I don't have time to figure out why my bartender has been hiding musical talents for 3 years. Can you really play well enough for tonight? This is important. Yes, Elena said, though her pulse quickened at the thought. I can do it. Thank God, Philip exhaled. Okay, you can take your break now and warm up or whatever you need to do. Trish can handle the bar for a bit. Elena nodded, untying her apron with fingers that didn't feel quite like her own. Was she really doing this? After all this time? She walked slowly toward the piano, aware of curious glances from regular customers who were used to seeing her behind the bar. The black grand piano gleamed under the soft spotlight, both inviting and intimidating. She sat down carefully on the bench, adjusting its height out of habit. The keys lay before her, black and white, familiar and foreign all at once. Elena placed, her hands on her lap for a moment, steadying herself. It had been so long. Almost 5 years since she'd performed for anyone, 3 years since she'd played at all, not counting the occasional moment of weakness when she'd tap out silent melodies on the kitchen counter of her small apartment. Elena closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and placed her hands on the keys. She began with a simple scale, just to feel the weight of the keys, the action of the hammers. The sound was rich and well-maintained. Mr. Winters insisted on keeping the instrument in perfect condition, even though most of the lounge's pianists didn't take full advantage of its capabilities. She moved into a simple jazz standard, Autumn Leaves, keeping it soft and unobtrusive. Her fingers were stiff at first, unused to the stretch and precision required. But muscle memory is a powerful thing. By the end of the first chorus, her hands remembered what her mind had tried to forget. A few patrons glanced over, nodding appreciatively at the music but not yet realizing a different person was at the piano. Elena kept playing, moving through familiar jazz progressions, gradually adding more complexity as her confidence returned. She was so absorbed in the music that she didn't notice Philip approaching until he was standing beside the piano. That sounds great, he said quietly. Really great, actually. They'll be here in 5 minutes. Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She'd managed the safe, expected background music so far, but now she'd have to play for the next 2 hours at least. Could she do it? Would the old panic return if people started really listening? As if reading her thoughts, Philip added, "Just keep doing what you're doing, no pressure. It's background music, not a concert." He walked away, greeting customers and checking that everything was in place for the important guests. Elena continued, playing, trying to focus only on the keys beneath her fingers and not on the door where the owner and investors would soon appear. She moved into a Gershwin piece, one that had once been as natural to her as breathing. Her hands found the notes without conscious thought, muscle memory taking over where practice had left off. And for a brief moment, as the familiar melody filled the space around her, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the pure joy of making music without fear. Then the front door opened, and Mr. Winters walked in, with 4 well-dressed people. Elena's fingers faltered for just a second before she steadied herself and continued playing. No one seemed to notice the tiny slip. She took a deep breath and focused on the keys again. She could do this. It was just background music in a dimly lit lounge. No one was really listening. No one knew who she used to be or what she had given up. For tonight, she was just the bartender filling in on piano. Nothing more. 10 years earlier, a very different Elena had stood backstage at the Vienna Academy of Music, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Through the small gap in the heavy curtains, she could see the grand piano waiting center stage under bright lights, and beyond it, row after row of faces, professors, fellow students, and visiting musicians who would judge the annual showcase performance. "You're up in 5 minutes," the stage manager had told her before moving on to check on the other performers. Elena had nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. She flexed her fingers and rolled her shoulders, trying to release the tension that had been building all day. She'd practiced Chopin's Ballet No. 1 in G minor hundreds of times. She knew every note, every dynamic shift, every challenging run. In the practice rooms, alone with just the piano and her thoughts, she played it beautifully. But on stage, with eyes watching and judging, everything changed. "You look like you're about to faint," a voice had said beside her. It was Professor Bauer, her piano instructor. A stern woman in her 60s who rarely offered praise but whose rare smiles Elena lived for. "I'm fine," Elena had lied, her voice barely audible. Professor Bauer had studied her with sharp eyes. "No, you're not, but you will be once you start playing." She'd placed a firm hand on Elena's shoulder. "You have a gift, Elena, one of the finest natural talents I have seen in 30 years of teaching. But you need to stop thinking about the people out there and remember why you play in the first place." Elena had nodded, trying to take the advice to heart. She'd been playing piano since she was 4 years old, sitting on her mother's lap as tiny fingers pressed down on the keys of their old upright piano. Music had been her first language, her truest form of expression. When had it become something that filled her with dread? "Remember," Professor Bauer had said just before Elena walked on stage, "the music exists with or without the audience. Play for yourself." But when Elena had stepped out onto that stage, the bright lights blinding her to the audience she knew was there, something had frozen inside her. She'd sat at the piano, placed her hands on the keys, and nothing. Her mind had gone completely blank. The opening notes of the ballade, which should have flowed automatically from her fingers, were suddenly foreign and unreachable. 10 seconds of silence had stretched into 20, then 30. She'd heard coughing, shuffling, whispers from the audience. Her hands had started to tremble. Finally, she'd managed to begin playing, but the damage was done. Her performance had been mechanical, disconnected, nothing like the soulful interpretation she was capable of. Afterward, backstage, Professor Bauer had found her crying in a practice room. "This doesn't define you," she'd said firmly. "One bad performance doesn't erase your talent." But for Elena, something had broken that day. The confidence that had carried her through years of training suddenly seemed like a house built on sand. And when the letter arrived 2 weeks later, informing her that she hadn't been selected for the prestigious summer program she'd been counting, and it felt like confirmation of what she already feared, that she didn't have what it took after all. That same month, her father had lost his job at the factory where he'd worked for 20 years. Her mother's part-time work at the local bakery wasn't enough to cover their expenses, let alone Elena's tuition at the academy. The timing had seemed like a sign. Maybe I should take a break, she'd told her parents over dinner one night. Get a job. Help out until things improve. Her parents had protested, insisting they would find a way to keep her in school. But Elena had already made up her mind. The failure on stage had planted a seed of doubt that grew larger each day. Taking a break would give her time to rebuild her confidence, she'd told herself. She would go back when she was ready. But days had turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. She'd found work as a waitress, then as a receptionist, and finally as a bartender. She'd moved first to London, then to New York, putting distance between herself and the life she'd abandoned. She'd told herself it was temporary, just until she felt ready to return to music. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was hiding. The only piano in her apartment was the small electronic keyboard she kept in the back of her closet, covered with a sheet. Some nights, after a long shift at the Blue Note, she would take it out and place it on her bed, plugging in headphones so no one would hear. Her fingers would hover over the keys for long minutes before she would sigh, unplug the keyboard, and return it to its hiding place without playing a single note. And now, here she was, sitting at a gleaming grand piano in a jazz lounge playing for strangers as if the past 10 years had never happened. The irony wasn't lost on her. Mr. Winters and his investors had settled at the best table in the house, the one with perfect sightlines to both the bar and the piano. Elena kept her head down, focusing on the keys, playing standards that were well within her abilities. She wasn't there to impress anyone, she reminded herself. She was just filling in, doing her job like she always did. But as the evening progressed, something began to shift. The familiar feeling of her fingers on the keys, the satisfying weight of the piano's action, the way the notes resonated in the space, it all reminded her body of what her mind had tried to forget. Playing the piano had once been as natural as breathing, and her lungs seemed to remember how to take in air properly for the first time in years. She moved from standards to gentle improvisations, weaving familiar melodies into new patterns. Without meaning to, she began to play more expressively, adding subtle dynamics and phrasing that transformed the background music into something more intentional. Across the room, she noticed a few patrons turning toward the piano, their conversations, pausing as they listened. One woman closed her eyes briefly, swaying slightly to the music. Mr. Winters glanced over several times, a curious expression on his face. Elena felt a flicker of the old anxiety and immediately pulled back, simplifying, her playing retreating to safer territory, but the music seemed to have a will of its own, pulling her fingers toward more interesting harmonies, more meaningful expressions. After an hour, Philip approached the piano during a natural pause between songs. "You're doing great," he said, genuine surprise in his voice. "The investors are impressed." Mr. Winters asked who you are. "What did you tell him?" Elena asked, continuing to play softly beneath their conversation. "That you're our bartender who apparently has hidden talents." He studied her for a moment. "Seriously, Elena, why have you never mentioned this before?" "You're really good," she shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's been a long time since I played regularly." "Well, keep it up for another hour, and then Trish needs your help back at the bar for the late crowd." He squeezed her shoulder lightly before walking away. Elena nodded, turning her attention back to the piano. Just one more hour, and then she could return to her normal role, her safe space behind the bar where no one expected anything special from her. But as she continued to play, memories began to surface, not of the failures and disappointments, but of earlier times. Her mother, teaching her heart and soul as a child. The first time she'd played Bach's Prelude in C major all the way through without mistakes. The joy on her father's face when she'd been accepted to the academy. The pure pleasure of losing herself in the music during long practice sessions. Why? Had she locked those memories away along with the painful ones? Without planning to, Elena began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece she'd once loved for its delicate beauty. Her fingers remembered the notes even after all these years, though she took it slower than she once would have. The lounge seemed to quiet around her as the familiar melody floated through the room. She closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the music. For a brief moment, there was no lounge, no audience, no past failures or uncertain future. Just the beautiful conversation between her fingers and the piano. When she opened her eyes, she noticed one of the investors watching her intently. He was an older man with silver hair and intelligent eyes, sitting slightly apart from the others at the table. Something about his focused attention made her nervous, and she quickly transitioned to a more conventional jazz standard to finish her set. As she played the final chords, gentle applause broke out from several tables. Elena felt her cheeks grow warm. She stood quickly, nodded a brief acknowledgement, and made her way back toward the bar. "That was something else," Trish said as Elena retied her apron. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "A long time ago," Elena replied, reaching for a cocktail shaker. "It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" Trish laughed. "I've worked here 2 years and never knew you could play at all, let alone like that. You're full of surprises, Elena Moretti." Elena forced a smile and turned her attention to mixing drinks, falling back into the comfortable rhythm of the bar. The brief return to her musical past had left her feeling strangely exposed, as if she'd revealed more of herself in those 90 minutes at the piano than she had in 3 years of working at the Blue Note. What she didn't notice was that the silver-haired investor was still watching her, a thoughtful expression on his face as he leaned over to say something to Mr. Winters. Nor did she see Mr. Winters's surprised reaction, or the way he glanced back at her with new interest. Elena was too busy trying to pretend that nothing had changed, even as she felt the protective walls she'd built around her past beginning to crumble. The next morning, Elena woke with stiff fingers. She flexed them above her face in the early light filtering through her apartment blinds, studying the slight soreness in her joints. It had been years since her hands had felt the particular ache that came from playing piano for an extended period. The sensation was both foreign and achingly familiar. She made coffee and carried the mug to her small balcony overlooking a quiet side street. Saturday morning meant she didn't have to be at the Blue Note until the evening shift. Usually, she filled these free hours with practical tasks: laundry, grocery shopping, occasionally meeting a friend for lunch. Today, however, her mind kept returning to the piano, to the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers, to the expressions on people's faces as they listened. After finishing her coffee, Elena went to her closet and pushed aside hanging clothes to reveal the electronic keyboard hidden in the back. She hadn't touched it in months, maybe longer. Dust had settled on the black case. She pulled it out and set it on her bed, plugging it in and connecting headphones. When she pressed the power button, the small screen lit up with a welcome message. Elena placed her fingers on the keys, so much lighter and less substantial than the grand piano at the lounge, and began to play. Simple scales at first, then arpeggios, then a Bach invention she had once known by heart. Her fingers stumbled occasionally, missing notes they would have found effortlessly a decade ago, but the muscle memory remained surprisingly intact. She played for almost an hour, lost in the private world created by the headphones and the music only she could hear. When her phone buzzed with a text message, it startled her back to reality. It was from Philip. "Mr. Winters wants to talk to you before your shift tonight. Can you come in at 5 instead of 6? Elena stared at the message, a knot forming in her stomach. Had she done something wrong last night? Was Mr. Winters upset that she'd stepped in without permission? Or maybe he just wanted to know why she'd never mentioned her piano skills before. She typed back a simple yes, then unplugged the keyboard and returned it to the closet, suddenly eager to put it away. The rest of the day passed too quickly. At 4:45, Elena stood outside the Blue Note, smoothing down her black shirt and taking deep breaths to calm her nerves. She reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong. If anything, she had helped out in an emergency. There was no reason to feel anxious. Inside, the lounge was quiet, still an hour away from opening. A few staff members were setting up tables and stocking the bar, but there was no sign of Philip or Mr. Winters. There she is, Trish called from behind the bar. Our secret piano prodigy. Elena forced a smile. Very funny. No, seriously, Trish said, coming around to meet her. You were amazing last night. Ray better watch out or you'll steal his gig. I was just filling in, Elena said firmly. Where's Philip? In the office with Mr. Winters and some guy who was here last night. They asked me to send you back when you arrived. Trish gave her an encouraging smile. Don't look so worried. Pretty sure you're not in trouble. Elena nodded and made her way to the small office at the back of the lounge. She knocked lightly on the door. Come in, called Philip's voice. She opened the door to find Philip behind his desk, Mr. Winters in one of the visitor chairs, and across from him, the silver-haired investor who had watched her so intently the night before. Ah, Elena, Mr. Winters said, standing to greet her. He was a tall man in his 50s with the confident air of someone used to success. Thank you for coming in early. Please have a seat. Elena sat in the remaining chair, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. This is Arthur Cooper, Mr. Winters said, gesturing to the silver-haired man. He was quite impressed with your playing last night. Arthur Cooper extended his hand and Elena shook it automatically. Very impressed, he said, his voice carrying the faint traces of a British accent, particularly with your interpretation of Debussy. Thank you, Elena said quietly, unsure where this conversation was heading. Mr. Winters leaned forward. Arthur, here isn't just an investor. He's also on the board of the New York Symphony Orchestra. Elena felt her heart skip a beat. She looked at Arthur Cooper with new understanding. No wonder he had watched her so carefully. I was telling Jack about your performance, Cooper said, nodding toward Mr. Winters. It's not often one finds such talent in unexpected places. It was just background music, Elena said, her voice smaller than she intended. Cooper shook his head. No, it wasn't. Even playing standards, your touch and phrasing showed years of classical training. And that Debussy? He paused. Where did you study? The direct question caught Elena off guard. She hadn't talked about her past musical life in so long that the words felt strange in her mouth. The Vienna Academy of Music, but I didn't finish. Cooper's eyebrows rose. Vienna? That's quite prestigious. May I ask why you didn't complete your studies? Elena glanced at Philip, who looked as surprised as she felt by this turn in the conversation. Family circumstances, she said simply, not wanting to explain further. Cooper nodded, seeming to understand her reluctance. Well, the reason we wanted to speak with you is that I have a proposition. A proposition? Elena repeated. Yes. Next Friday, the Symphony is hosting a fundraising event at the Morgan Library. Our usual pianist for these functions has taken ill, seems to be going around and won't be recovered in time. We need someone who can provide elegant background music for the cocktail hour and perhaps a short featured performance during the dinner. Elena stared at him, not fully processing what he was saying. Arthur has asked if we would be willing to lend you for the evening, Mr. Winters explained. The Blue Note would be credited in the program, of course, which would be excellent publicity for us. You want me to play at a symphony fundraiser? Elena asked, the words feeling unreal as she spoke them. Yes, Cooper said simply. Nothing too demanding. Some classical pieces during the cocktail hour, perhaps a jazz standard or two during dinner, and then one showcase piece of your choosing. We would pay you, of course. Elena's mind raced. A year ago, a week ago, the thought of playing in front of symphony board members and wealthy donors would have sent her into a panic. But after last night, after feeling the keys beneath her fingers again, part of her was tempted. I don't know, she said hesitantly. It's been a very long time since I performed properly. Last night seemed proper enough to me, Cooper said, with a gentle smile. But I understand your hesitation. Perhaps you'd like some time to think about it. Mr. Winters jumped in before Elena could respond. Of course she'll do it. Right, Elena? It's a wonderful opportunity for you and great exposure for the Blue Note. Elena looked between the two men, feeling cornered. Philip caught her eye and gave her a small nod of encouragement. Can I have until tomorrow to decide? She asked finally. Cooper smiled. Of course. Here's my card. Call me when you've made your decision. He handed her a sleek business card with the symphony's logo embossed in gold. After Cooper left, Mr. Winters turned to Elena with an enthusiastic expression. This is exactly the kind of connection I was hoping to make with those investors. The symphony crowd is perfect for our brand. You'll do it, won't you? Elena tucked Cooper's card into her pocket. I'll think about it, she said, neither committing nor refusing. Mr. Winters clapped her on the shoulder. That's my girl. Now, back to your regular duties for tonight. Ray will be here to play as usual. As Elena walked back to the bar to begin her shift, her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to call Cooper immediately and say yes. Another part wanted to run as far from the piano as possible. So? Trish asked when Elena took her place behind the bar. What was that all about? Nothing, Elena said, reaching for a bottle to begin setting up. Just talking about last night. Uh-huh, Trish said skeptically. That's why you look like you've seen a ghost. Elena managed a weak smile but didn't elaborate. How could she explain what she was feeling when she barely understood it herself? The evening shift passed in a blur. Elena mixed drinks on autopilot, her mind elsewhere. She found herself stealing glances at the piano, where Ray sat playing his usual set. His technique was solid but safe. She could hear opportunities for more interesting interpretations in almost every piece, places where the music could breathe more fully, express more deeply. When had she started thinking like a musician? Again? After closing, Elena walked home instead of taking the subway, needing the time to think. The city streets were still lively even at midnight, full of people going to and from late dinners, clubs, and shows. She passed a street musician playing saxophone on a corner, the mournful notes following her for half a block. In her apartment, she took out Cooper's card and placed it on her kitchen counter. Then she retrieved the keyboard from her closet again. This time, she didn't use headphones. She played scales first, warming up her fingers. Then she began to work through pieces she had once known intimately. Bach, Mozart, Chopin. Some came back easily, muscle memory guiding her fingers through familiar patterns. Others remained frustratingly out of reach, her hands stumbling over passages that had once flowed effortlessly. After an hour, her fingers aching but in a satisfying way, Elena pulled out her phone and searched for a recording of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It had been her favorite piece to play in her academy days, challenging but deeply rewarding. She closed her eyes and listened to the opening chords, dark and resonant, followed by the rising melody that always made her heart ache with its beauty. Could she still play it? Not the full concerto, certainly. That required an orchestra. But perhaps the solo parts, adapted for a single piano. It would be incredibly challenging after so much time away from serious practice. But if she was going to return to the piano, even for one night, why not reach for something meaningful? Elena looked at Cooper's card on the counter. Then she picked up her phone and set an alarm for early the next morning. If she was going to do this, and she was starting to think she might, she would need every available hour to practice. As she finally lay in bed, exhaustion pulling her toward sleep, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. What if you fail again? What if the panic returns? But for the first time in years, another voice answered back. What if it doesn't? The Morgan Library's elegant reading room had been transformed for the symphony fundraiser. Round tables draped in white linen filled the space beneath the soaring ceiling and ornate bookshelves. Soft lighting cast a warm glow over the rare books, and manuscripts displayed in glass cases along the walls. And at the far end of the room, positioned perfectly so the acoustics would carry throughout the space, stood a magnificent Steinway grand piano. Elena stood in a small side room, peering through a crack in the door at the guests arriving in formal attire. Women in flowing gowns and men in tuxedos mingled in the adjoining hall, champagne glasses in hand. The cocktail hour would begin in 15 minutes, and her fingers were already trembling. She looked down at her simple black dress, the nicest thing she owned, but still modest compared to the finery outside. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat chignon, and she wore her mother's pearl earrings for luck. She had debated whether to wear the minimal makeup she usually did for work or something more dramatic for the occasion, eventually settling on a slightly enhanced version of her everyday look. She wanted to feel like herself tonight, not like she was wearing a costume. "There you are," said Arthur Cooper, appearing suddenly beside her. He wore a well-tailored tuxedo and looked completely at ease. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," Elena admitted, seeing no point in pretending otherwise. Cooper smiled kindly. "That's entirely normal. But remember, these people are here to support the symphony and enjoy good music. They're already on your side." Elena nodded, trying to take comfort in his words. Over the past week, she had practiced every spare moment, pushing her fingers to remember what they once knew so well. She had called in favors to get time on a real piano at a local music school during off hours, knowing her keyboard at home wasn't enough to prepare properly. The Rachmaninoff piece she had chosen was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious after so many years away from serious playing. But something about its passionate, sweeping melodies spoke to the emotions churning inside her. If she was going to return to the piano, even for just one night, she wanted it to mean something. "The cocktail hour is about to begin," Cooper said, checking his watch. "Are you ready?" Elena took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked together into the main room. A few heads turned as Cooper led her to the piano, but most guests were too engaged in conversation to pay much attention. This was exactly what Elena had hoped for. A chance to ease into playing without all eyes on her. She sat at the bench, adjusting its height and position. The Steinway was a far superior instrument to anything she had practiced on this week. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, feeling their weight and response. Then she began to play a gentle Bach prelude, something simple to warm up her fingers and settle her nerves. The conversations around her continued, exactly as they should during cocktail music. No one was listening too closely yet, which allowed Elena to find her rhythm, to remember what it felt like to play in a space filled with people rather than her empty apartment. After Bach, she moved into Debussy, then a Chopin nocturne. Gradually, she noticed a few guests pausing in their conversations to listen for a moment before returning to their discussions. One older woman stopped near the piano, glass in hand, and closed her eyes briefly as Elena played a particularly beautiful passage from Schubert. An hour passed, then another. Waiters appeared to guide guests to their tables for dinner. Elena shifted to more contemporary pieces as the meal began. Gentle jazz standards and modern classical compositions that would complement conversation rather than demand attention. Cooper appeared at her side during a natural pause, offering her a glass of water. "You're doing wonderfully," he said quietly. "Everyone is impressed." "Really?" Elena asked, taking a sip of water to ease her dry throat. "Really. The showcase piece will be after the main course before dessert. I'll give you a signal when it's time." Elena nodded, returning the glass and flexing her fingers before beginning another piece. As she played, she scanned the room, taking in the elegant crowd. At one table near the center, she spotted Mr. Winters deep in conversation with a group of well-dressed guests. He caught her eye and raised his glass in a small salute. Trish had insisted on taking her shift tonight so Elena could be here. "You'd better play your heart out," she had said, giving Elena a quick hug before she left for the event. "I want a full report tomorrow." The dinner progressed, and Elena continued to play, moving between styles and composers with growing confidence. The piano responded beautifully to her touch, its rich tone filling the room even when she played softly. She was so absorbed in the music that she almost missed Cooper's signal when it finally came. He approached the piano as she finished a piece, then turned to address the room, tapping a spoon against his glass to gain everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and friends of the symphony," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the space. "I hope you're enjoying this wonderful evening in support of music education in our city." Murmurs of agreement and a light scatter of applause followed. "As many of you know, our usual pianist, Thomas Bergman, is unfortunately ill this evening. but we have been incredibly fortunate to discover a remarkable talent to take his place." He gestured toward Elena. "I first heard Elena Moretti play at the Blue Note Lounge where she normally works as a bartender." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Elena felt her cheeks grow warm as dozens of eyes turned toward her. "But what you might not know," Cooper continued, "is that Ms. Moretti was once a student at the Vienna Academy of Music, one of Europe's most prestigious conservatories." Elena stared at Cooper in surprise. She hadn't told him that much about her background. He must have done some research. "Tonight she will perform a special piece for us, a solo adaptation of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Please join me in welcoming Elena Moretti." The applause that followed was polite but curious. Elena took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. This was the moment she had been preparing for and dreading all week. She positioned her hands above the keys, closed her eyes briefly, and began to play. The opening chords of the Rachmaninoff were dark and resonant, building slowly in intensity. Elena felt the familiar notes flow from her fingers, her body remembering what her mind had tried to forget. The piece moved from its somber beginning into passages of sweeping emotion and technical complexity. As she played, the room around her seemed to fade away. There was only the music, the beautiful conversation between her hands and the piano, between Rachmaninoff's genius and her own interpretation. All the years of training, all the hours of practice in her youth, all came rushing back in this moment. Her fingers flew across difficult passages that a week ago had seemed impossible after so much time away from serious playing. There were small mistakes, notes that weren't quite perfect, but she didn't let them break her focus. Instead, she poured herself into the emotional heart of the piece, its longing, its passion, its moments of both darkness and transcendent beauty. When she reached the famous melody of the second movement, adapted for solo piano, she heard a collective intake of breath from the audience. The heartbreakingly beautiful theme soared through the room, and Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she played. This was why she had fallen in love with the piano as a child, why she had once been willing to dedicate her life to music. For moments like this, when notes on a page became something that could touch the human soul. The final movement built to its triumphant conclusion, and Elena's hands struck the last chords with all the passion and precision she could summon. For a moment after the final notes faded, there was complete silence. Then the room erupted in applause, not the polite, obligatory kind that had greeted her introduction, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. People rose to their feet, napkins set aside, dinner forgotten. Elena stood from the bench, slightly dizzy from the intensity of the performance, and gave a small bow. The applause continued, washing over her in waves. She saw Cooper beaming at her from the side of the room. Mr. Winters was on his feet, clapping vigorously. An older woman in the front wiped tears from her eyes. It wasn't Carnegie Hall. It wasn't even a proper concert. But in that moment, Elena felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a decade, the pure joy of sharing music with others. The overwhelming anxiety that had driven her from the stage years ago was still there, a knot in her stomach, but it hadn't defeated her this time. As the applause finally began to die down, Cooper returned to her side. "That was extraordinary," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Truly extraordinary." "Thank you," Elena whispered, her own voice unsteady. "I'd like to introduce you to some people after dessert," Cooper said, "if you're willing." Elena nodded, still caught in the afterglow of the performance. She returned to the piano to play softer pieces during dessert, but she could feel the difference in how people were listening now. Conversations had hushed. Heads were turned toward the piano. She was no longer background music. A young waiter stopped by the piano to offer her a glass of champagne, breaking protocol but seeming not to care. "That was amazing," he whispered. "I've never heard anything like it." Elena smiled and thanked him, declining the champagne but appreciating the gesture. As she continued to play, her mind was already racing ahead. Cooper wanted to introduce her to people. Important people in the music world, presumably. What would that mean? What did she want it to mean? For so long she had locked away this part of herself, convinced that she didn't have what it took to survive in the competitive world of classical music. Tonight hadn't erased those doubts entirely, but it had shown her something important, that the music was still inside her waiting to be expressed, and that perhaps the greatest tragedy wasn't failing on stage but never giving herself the chance to try again. 6 months later, Elena stood backstage at the Blue Note Lounge, listening to the buzz of conversation from the packed room beyond the curtain. What had once been a typical Friday night crowd had transformed into something else entirely. A dedicated audience, tickets purchased weeks in advance, gathered specifically to hear her play. 5 minutes, Philip said, poking his head through the doorway of the small room that had been converted into a proper backstage area. Full house again. Elena nodded, flexing her fingers and rolling her shoulders to release tension. The nervousness was still there before each performance, but it had become a familiar companion rather than a paralyzing force. So much had changed since that night at the Morgan Library. Videos taken by guests had circulated online, catching the attention of local music blogs and classical radio stations. The story had proven irresistible. The bartender with conservatory training who had abandoned music only to make a triumphant return. A local news station had done a 3-minute feature on her, filming her both mixing drinks and playing piano at the Blue Note. Mr. Winters, ever the savvy businessman, had recognized an opportunity. Within 2 weeks of the fundraiser, he had transformed the Blue Note Saturday nights into Elena Moretti, From Bach to Blues, featuring Elena in a 90-minute performance that crossed genres and musical periods. The first few shows had sold out immediately, and now, 6 months later, they were still going strong. Elena glanced at the program sitting on the small table beside her. Tonight's performance began with Bach's Italian Concerto, moved through Chopin and Debussy, ventured into jazz interpretations of standards, and concluded with Rachmaninoff. Always Rachmaninoff, her signature piece that audiences had come to expect, and that still moved her every time she played it. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Trish entered carrying a small bouquet of flowers. "These just arrived for you," she said, placing them on the table. "Secret admirer again?" Elena smiled and opened the small card attached to the flowers. "Not so secret. They're from Professor Bauer. She's in town for a conference and coming to tomorrow's show." Professor Bauer had reached out after seeing a video of Elena playing Chopin online. Their reunion had been tearful and healing, the stern teacher admitting she had always wondered what had happened to her promising student who disappeared so suddenly. They had reconnected through long emails and occasional phone calls, rebuilding a relationship that now felt more balanced than the intimidating teacher-student dynamic of Elena's youth. "You ready for tonight?" Trish asked, leaning against the doorframe. She still worked full-time at the bar while Elena had reduced her bartending shifts to just 2 nights a week, spending the rest of her time practicing and performing. "As ready as I'll ever be," Elena replied, echoing the words she had spoken before the fundraiser that had changed everything. "Cooper's out there again," Trish said. "3rd time this month." Arthur Cooper had become something of a mentor to Elena, introducing her to contacts in the music world and offering guidance as she navigated her unexpected return to performing. He had arranged for her to play at several smaller symphony events, and had recently begun suggesting she consider more formal concert venues. "He's bringing the director of the Chamber Music Society tonight," Elena said, a flutter of nerves rising at the thought. "They're looking for soloists for their winter series." Trish grinned. "Look at you, getting all fancy on us. Don't forget the little people when you're playing Carnegie Hall." Elena laughed. "I think Carnegie Hall is a long way off, and besides, I have no plans to leave the Blue Note. This place gave me back my music." It was true. While other opportunities had begun to appear, guest performances at various venues around the city, an offer to record a small album of classical and jazz interpretations, Elena remained loyal to the lounge where her second chance had begun. Mr. Winters had been smart enough to give her the freedom to pursue outside projects while keeping her Saturday night shows as the anchor of her schedule. 2 minutes, Philip called through the door. Elena stood and smoothed down her dress, a deep blue gown that she had purchased with her first performance earnings. So different from the practical black shirt and pants she had worn behind the bar. She still kept those clothes in her closet and wore them for her bartending shifts, a reminder of where she had been and the unexpected path her life had taken. As she stepped toward the door, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her mother. "Play your heart out tonight, sweetheart. We're so proud of you." Her parents had flown in from Europe to see her perform last month, their first trip to New York. Watching their faces as she played, her mother crying, openly her father trying to hide his own tears, had been one of the most healing moments of Elena's life. They had never pressured her about abandoning her music studies, had supported her decision to work rather than continue at the academy. But seeing their pride as she returned to the piano had relieved a burden of guilt she hadn't fully acknowledged she was carrying. "It's time," Philip said, appearing at the door again. Elena took a deep breath and followed him through the short hallway that led to the performance space. The Blue Note looked different now on Saturday nights. The tables had been rearranged to face the piano, which had been moved to a small raised platform at one end of the room. The lighting had been adjusted to create a more concert-like atmosphere, though it still retained the intimate feel of a jazz lounge. As Elena stepped into view, the audience broke into applause. She smiled and gave a small bow before taking her seat at the piano. Looking out over the crowded room, she spotted Cooper sitting at a table near the front, with an elegant older woman she assumed was the Chamber Music Society director. Mr. Winters stood at the back, arms crossed, a satisfied expression on his face as he surveyed the packed house. And there at the bar, Trish gave her a thumbs up. Elena turned to the piano, placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The Bach flowed from her hands with confidence and precision, each note clear and intentional. As she moved from piece to piece, she felt herself sink deeper into the music, into the conversation between composer and performer that transcended time and place. The audience was silent between pieces, attentive in a way that still surprised her. These people had come specifically to listen, not to treat the music as background for their conversations. It was a responsibility Elena took seriously, choosing her programs carefully to create a journey through different musical worlds. When she reached the Rachmaninoff, she paused briefly, gathering herself for the piece that had become her signature. Then she began the dark, resonant opening chords that always sent a shiver through the audience. As the piece progressed, Elena lost herself in its emotional landscape, in the technical challenges that now felt like old friends rather than insurmountable obstacles. The final chords rang out through the room, and for a moment there was silence. Then the applause began, growing into a standing ovation as it did at the end of every performance. Elena stood and bowed, her heart full. After the show, as always, she made her way to the bar where a small line of audience members waited to speak with her. Some were regulars who came to every performance, others were newcomers curious about the bartender-turned-pianist they had heard about from friends or read about online. "That was beautiful," said an older man, shaking her hand. "Your Rachmaninoff made my wife cry." "In a good way," his wife added quickly, dabbing at her eyes. Elena thanked them, chatting briefly before moving on to the next person. She had learned to accept compliments more gracefully over the months, though it still felt strange sometimes to be the center of such attention. Cooper appeared at the end of the line, the Chamber Music Society director beside him. "Elena, I'd like you to meet Dorothy Liang. Dorothy, this is Elena Moretti." The elegant woman extended her hand. "That was quite remarkable, Ms. Moretti. Arthur has told me about your unusual journey, but hearing you play—" She paused. "Well, talent speaks for itself, doesn't it?" "Thank you," Elena said, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "We should talk about the winter series," Dorothy continued, "and perhaps some other opportunities as well. Do you have representation?" Cooper stepped in smoothly. "Let's discuss those details over lunch next week, shall we? Tonight is for celebrating another successful performance." As they moved away to their table, Trish slid a glass of water across the bar to Elena. "Look at you getting all important offers," she teased. "Should I start calling you Maestro?" Elena laughed and took a sip of water. I think just Elena is fine. After the crowd had thinned, Mr. Winters approached the bar. Another triumph, he said, clearly pleased. Bookings for next month are already at 90% capacity. That's great, Elena said, genuinely happy that her performances were good for business. You know, he said, leaning in slightly, when I hired you 3 years ago, I thought I was getting a competent bartender. I had no idea I was getting the main attraction. Neither did I, Elena admitted. Life is full of surprises. Later that night, as Elena walked home through the quiet city streets, she thought about the strange and unexpected path that had led her here. 10 years of hiding from music, of believing she didn't have what it took, of thinking her chance had passed. And then one night of necessity, of stepping in when no one else was available, had changed everything. She still wasn't the concert pianist she had once dreamed of becoming as a student in Vienna. Her path was different now, more eclectic, crossing boundaries between classical and jazz, between the formal concert hall and the intimate lounge. And she still felt the nervousness before each performance, still made occasional mistakes, still had moments of doubt. But she was playing again. The music that had always been inside her had found its way out, found its audience. She had discovered that there was more than one way to be a pianist, more than one definition of success. As she reached her apartment building, Elena paused and looked up at the night sky, barely visible through the city lights. 10 years ago, a moment of failure had convinced her to give up on her dreams. Now she understood that failure wasn't the end of the story. It was just another note in the complex, beautiful composition that was her life. Tomorrow, she would practice new pieces for next week's performance. She would meet with Cooper and Dorothy Liang to discuss the Chamber Music Society offer. She would work her regular bartending shift in the evening. And through it all, the music would be there, no longer locked away but flowing freely through her life, connecting her past to her present and opening doors to a future she had once thought impossible. Elena smiled to herself as she entered her building. Her job had been to serve drinks, until she served a masterpiece on piano. But the real masterpiece wasn't any single performance. It was the courage to begin again, to share her gift with the world, to transform failure into a new beginning. And that was a composition still in progress.